Let's create a procedural digital clock in Blender. Now we're in countdown mode, but if you haven't subscribed yet, about 90% of you aren't subscribed, please do leave a like and comment as well. It would help me out a lot. So let's dive into this actual clock. I can change this from a countdown into a clock just like that, and it will start from whatever value we start here. So let me reset my time, and we can start from any kind of timing and automatically start the clock. We can change the regular values, the font sizes, blah, 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 divider. We can even turn this into a 12-hour base clock with AM and PM, and it will automatically toggle at the 12-hour marks, right? Like you would for a regular clock as well. Now I'll teach you how to set this up in geometry nodes in a very fun and easy manner, and let's dive right in. We can just start off with the default cube. We can select it. We can hit new with the geometry nodes, and we have a new setup. Now we can just disconnect this, right? We don't need the cube. We're just going to add some new geometry in here. And what you need to know is that there's a few ways in Blender to really play around with your scene time, right? And the scene time basically is the time you see here in your playback, in your timeline. You see frames, but you can also realize that each 24 frames, depending on your frame rate here that is set in your output, 24 frames will make up 1 second, 48 2 seconds, and so on. And there's two ways to really access this, and first is with drivers. And there's a real easy way to do that. We're not going to use it, but I will show you nonetheless, because in the shader editor, we can't really use that properly. So in shader editor, we do not have a scene time node, while in the geometry nodes, we do have a scene time node. So in your shaders, for example, let's say you want to have an increasing emission brightness over time. What you can do is you can find an emission node. You can set this strength to be hashtag, which will create a driver value, and you can type in frame. And this is going to pick your current frame from your timeline, right? If you want seconds, you can just divide that by your frame rate, 24, for example. So now you have a value that increases with 1 for each second that goes on, right? And then you can just use that, plug it into your service. Easy as that. Now in your geometry nodes, we can use drivers as well, but we can also just use the scene time nodes, which is just easier because it does the division to seconds for us. So we can use this for our digital clock. Now, you know what a digital clock looks like, right? We have hours on the left. This is like 12 o'clock midnight. Then we have minutes, and then we have seconds. So how do we create this in a way where it's actually works? So this flips to 1 when this hits 60, and this flips to 1 when this hits 60, but this does not go over 24, and it resets back to 0. So the easiest way to do this is, let's just think about this as increments. We're just going to start off from the right, from seconds, because it's the easiest, right? And we will set it up from there. So scene time seconds, we can just turn this value into a string. Value to string. There we go. And then we can do string to curves. And then we can do a fill curve, right? And that way we can already start seeing what we are doing, right? So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, blah, 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 blah. Now, the way this jumps is not really how I like it. Okay, because, well, it is fine that it goes to 10, but I also want a 0 to be in front here when nothing is there yet. So it doesn't really jump when it goes from 9 to 10, right? That's a jump that you wouldn't see in digital clocks. So we have to fix that for sure. Now, another thing that you may notice is that the seconds already jump to 1 when our frame is not even at 24. Now, the reason this happens is because, well, this is rounding automatically, which means if our value here, right, our seconds, if it is going over 0.5, which is, I guess, the frame divided by 24, which is, let's say, 12 divided by 24, is 0.5. Then if it goes over that value, it's going to round up to 1 second already. Okay, and that's not really what we want. We want this to pop to 1 when our frames hit 24. Okay, so we can just round this quite easily with a math node, and we can set this to, or actually we can do this easier. We can do float to integer, and then we can set this to be a floor value. And that means it's only going to pop to the next value when it actually hits that value as well, right? So that means that this is only going to pop to 1 when our frames hit 24, which matches perfectly. All right, we can delete this, bye-bye. So this is our initial setup for our seconds, right? Although we still need to do something to fix that popping from 9 to 10. So how are we going to do that? Well, in Blender, you can join strings, right? So we can find Shift-A, join string. Here we go. And then we can pop this in front there, and we can just pop this into the strings value input. So now we're joining two strings. And what I want to do is that whenever we are under the value of 10 here, right, we can actually hit or add a 0 in front of the 1. So how do we do that? Well, this floor value here is going to set our integer for the time, and we can actually do a little compare node. And if this is less than 10, let's set this to 10, we can actually add a string value, right? So let's do Shift-A, an integer, set to 0, because we always want to add that 0 in front, which is just a 0 integer that we convert to a string, right? So let's set this to value to string here. Now we have that 0, if you plug that in, always 0. And we want to switch, let me just move this to the right a little bit. We want to switch between our normal value, this, right? Between this value when it hits 10. And we want to switch between this value plus that 0 in front when it's less than 10, right? So we can use this to a switch node, and we can actually set this switch node to be a string. And if this is less than 10, it's true. And we want to add that 0, right? Join string, join strings. And then we want to have that 0 joined with that value between 0 and 9 here, if it's true. And if it's false, if it is actually greater than 10, we just want our, we don't need that, we just want our regular seconds value, right? Which is going to be 10, 11, 12, 13, right? We don't need the 0 at that point anymore. So then we can just connect this in the string, and now we should be able to see that once it hits 10, it pops over nicely, right? 0 in front from 0 to 9, and hitting 10, it will decrease or remove that 0, and our normal value will pick back up at 10. All right, so this is a beautiful switch, and this is a switch that we're going to need for more occasions, right? When we are going to play around with the minutes, this also needs to happen. We need that 0 in front before it's going to hit 10. So how do we do that? Well, let's just group these nodes, right? Let's press Shift, hold it, and right mouse, drag a line across here, so we connect these dots here, just to make sure that when we select all of this, including that little dot, and press Ctrl G, we will only have one input value here, right, and an output string. Beautiful. So exit that group and move everything a little bit closer again, quite beautifully like that. So let's call this, how we're gonna call this, jump counter. Beautiful, jump counter. And our input is just our time, right? And the output is that beautiful string. So how do we now add our minutes in front of this? Well, it's going to be quite easy. So anything we want to do mathematically wise, we want to do before that floor element here. And we can just drag this a little bit to the left, and we want to divide our value here, our seconds, and you can actually drag this out from your seconds, and then it will automatically search for the node to connect to, which is very easy. And then you can type in divide, and then we divide by 60, right? Because that is just how we go from seconds to minutes, right? Every 60 seconds, we jump 1 minute. So we can actually use this to another floor node, of course, because, well, we want to round down as long as possible until we hit that next value. And then we can use this to another jump counter here, right? And we can join our strings, here. And what you have to know is that when you join strings, the front input will always be on the left, depending on how you align this, of course. But I'm just going to do my minutes on the left here, so input that on the top, and input this one here on the bottom. And you may not really be able to tell perfectly when you have it on top and the bottom, but your string here, your bottom string, will jump slightly depending on where you add it in. Right, so I'm going to add this in at the bottom. Was that right? Let's see. Yeah, that's right. So now when our value here hits 60, we add a 1. That's beautiful. Now, one thing that is happening is that this goes over 60. It should jump back to 0. Now, there's a very easy way to do this. Luckily, we can find Shift-A, a math node, set this to be truncated modulo to 60, and that will mean it's just going to restart at 60, right? That easily. So 59, 60, 0, right? And it's going to count back up. Once we hit 60 again, it goes to 2. Now we need that same truncated modulo, of course, for the minutes. Minutes don't go over 60, so we can add this in as well to there. So now when we have 60 minutes, we have to jump a little bit into the future here. There, it hits back to 0. And then it should add an hour. So how do we go from this to hours? Well, we divide our minutes by 60 again. There we go. And we hit another floor there. Beautiful. We add another truncated modulo. And this truncated modulo will not be set to 60, of course, but it's going to set at, you guessed it, 24, or well, depending on if you're going to use AM and PM or just use 24 hours. And that is, of course, going to depend. You can set this to 12 and add an AM and PM as well. I like the 24 clock better, I always have. So I'm just going to use that, right? And then we join this at the top again. There we go. All right, so when the value hits 60, we will add an hour, right? So how do we test if we have 24 hours and it resets properly? Well, we can't really do it because our timeline is going to be kept at a value that is before 24 hours. But that doesn't matter because I want to be able to set a custom time input anyway, right? That means that, for example, you want your beautiful scene to start or show a specific time, right? Let's say you animate a character at night. It should be 2 a.m., 2 o'clock in the night, 02 hours. We want to be able to set that and have the clock still animate and run properly without having to do any work. So how do we do that? Well, we can, of course, add values to our scene time, right? You can imagine that if we add a value of 1, we're just going to add 1 second here. Right, and we can actually do this for all our values, minutes, hours, by doing a little bit of math, right? So let's add a value. This is going to be 1 second, for example, right? 1 second is 1 second. We duplicate this. We have a value of 60 for our minutes. Duplicate this 60 times 60, right? For our hours. So this is seconds, and you can rename something by pressing F2, seconds. Rename this to minutes and rename this to hours. Now, how do we work with this? Well, I want to be able to set a custom minutes and hour amount. For each hour I add, we need to add 3600 seconds to our time. Of course, that's just how it works. So what we can do is find a math node and we can set this to multiply, right? And this has to be 0 at first, because if we add 0 to the time, it should add 0 seconds, right? And we can do the same here. We multiply this by 0 and multiply this by 0. And we want that 0 to be a user-defined value, All right, which means that we can actually use this for a group input, right? Just drag it out, find group input, and there we go. Now with this selected, you can press Ctrl H to actually expose all your input values, right? Ctrl H will hide unused sockets and also show them. And we can just connect each of these values here. All right, then if you press N here, let's move this a bit to the left. We can actually open up that group sockets tab. If you don't see it, make sure you are in the group tab here. You can now rename these values. So the top one is seconds. Seconds. Then the second one here is going to be minutes, of course, minutes. And then the third one is going to be hours. All right, and let's right away set everything here to be an integer, 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 and there we go. Right, and let's also make sure that we properly set the minimum and the maximum values. For seconds, we have a minimum between 0 and, well, 60, or 59 probably, 0 and 59. And for minutes, we have 0 to 59, and then hours, we have 23, or 0, sorry, to 23. Right? So that is quite beautiful, and we can set this to be a factor, I guess. Does that help? Let's see if we now set the hours up. Yeah, so that will just add that nice slider so we can see how far along we are, right? We can do the same for minutes, set this to be a factor, and the seconds factor as well. That just adds that little slider animation, which I like a lot. So now we can join this all up with a math node. All right, and we just want to add all these values together. It doesn't really matter in which order you're going to do it, because it's an add node, so it's really independent of the order, right? And then in the end, we want to add all of that to our seconds here, and let's move all of this to the bottom there. Beautiful. So now I'm just going to start with hours, then minutes. Here you can just move them over, and then we are finished. Right, so now we can see if we play this, it's just our regular clock here. Let's zoom in a little bit to our timeline. You can see it's just a regular clock. And when we actually set a new hour, an extra hour, let's set this to 1, we're going to add 1 hour. We can set this to whatever value, 8, so we want us to start at 18 minutes and perhaps 40 seconds. And it's just going to start playing from that time. All right, it's really that easy. Now I want, for visual reasons, graphic reasons, I want to add some kind of split between our hours, minutes, and seconds because it's easier to read. And that's quite easy by joining a string again, right? So let's just do string, right? And we can just type in 2 dots, right? So I'm not sure what it's called. The double dot, is it called? I'm not sure. Divider, whatever. And then we can join strings, of course. And let's just, for each of these, join a string. So we don't have to play around with these values here. And there, and there. All right. And we want to join this one. And we want to always join that before the values, right? Before and before. We actually only need 2. The seconds don't need 1. There we go, because we don't need 1. Actually, the hours don't need 1. I messed that up. There we go. The hours don't need 1 because we don't need 1 in front of the hours. So we can just connect this to the top here. There in the string, top, and here at the top. And then we have our proper dividers, right? We can also do some other symbols, like just a straight line is cool as well. And we can change the font as well. And for example, I usually just go for Segu UI for a lot of my textual things. I'm not sure how they look in numbers, but we can try. It's better. Just try Arial Black, cool. You can just set whatever you like here. Let's go for this one and change a bit of the spacing here. Beautiful. Right, so now we have a clock. Let's just go to the divider symbol again, right? Beautiful. And we can even just use this, remove that, just do a group input. Hello, group input. There we go. We could connect that here. It's going to be a string. And we can set this to divider, right? And we can just set our own custom symbol here, right? That makes it even nicer for the user, I suppose. Now, a final step will be toggling between 24-hour clock and 12-hour clock, and it's actually quite easy. Let's build it into the geometry node. So let's find a switch node, and we want to switch a float number of a modulo. And we can do an integer as well, actually. That's quite easy too. And we want this to switch between 12 hours and 24 hours. And we want the output to be that value there. And of course, if we switch this on, it's going to be 23. And I want it to be on by default. So maybe I'm just going to switch these around. So 24 and 12. And this switch is going to be a group input value. There we go. And let's name this. What is it usually called? I'm just going to call this 12. No, other way around. 24, 12 hours. There we go. And yes, that is step one. But now we still need the AM/PM toggle to join here as well. So how do we do that, right? We want to have an AM/PM indication. Otherwise, we don't know the time, if it's at night or during the day. So how do we do that? Well, what we can do quite easily is we have the hours here, right? So this is an hour value. And we can use the same truncated modulo here, but this time always at 24. And I'll explain in a second why. So if we do this, we will always wrap our values between 0 and up to 24, right? So it will go back to 0 once it hits that 24 mark. And then we divide this by 12. And this means that we will always have an output between 0 and 2, right? Because when we have an hour of 24, this will be divided by 12 is 2. When we have 12 divided by 12, it's going to be 1. So what we want to do is for any values between 0 and 12, that is going to result in a value between 0 and 1. And if we floor that value, right, we can math floor this, and that's always going to floor it down and to the nearest integer, right? You can also just use a float to integer here and just floor that, right? It's the same kind of thing we're doing here. And this value is going to be our switch, right? Because if we hit, let's say we hit 11 hours, right? Let's set this to 11. Then we have 11 divided by 12 is 0.9 something, right? Flooring that down is going to equal 0. So values from 0 to 0.999 is going to output 0. And values from 1 to 1.999 is going to equal in, let's say we do a 23 divided by 12 is going to be 1.99. Flooring that down is going to give us a 1, right? Then restarting that cycle because of the truncated modulo will reset it back to 0. So this is exactly what we need to set up a switch, right? So we can now turn this into a switch of the switch value between two strings. So set this to string value. False is going to be, we start at AM and then we do a PM. And then we can just join this. Why is it all the way over there? We can just join this as well. Okay, but I'm not going to join this in the same string because I want it to be somewhere nicely at the top there, for example. So what we can do is just set this to string to curves here, there, and then we can just join the geometry before we fill the curves. There we go. And then we can just set the position to be somewhere where we want it, right? So we can just size it down and set it to be, what is a normal placement for that? I'm not just completely sure, but I quite like this, I suppose. And then when we just swap these hours to 12, you can see it switching to PM. And if we set this to 23, 59, 59, and we just play it, it's going to switch nicely back to AM, right? So now we have our beautiful AM, PM switch. And this should only be there when we, of course, have this toggle. So what we can do is switch there between geometry, and only if this is true we want to show that AM PM. If it's false, we don't want to show any of that geometry. Now, of course, we need to connect this switch. So find your group input node and connect that 24/12 hours switch and press Ctrl H there. Right, so now when we uncheck this, it will be gone, and let's just set this to 13. And if we turn this on, it will be 01 p.m. All right, isn't that just a beautiful clock? Now the rest of this is just going to be you shaping your beautiful clock. All right, and you can place this anywhere. Let's just, you know, make all of this a nice group input as well. Group input, hello, group input. This will be our size for our time font size, I guess. And then we have character spacing as well. Control H, connect that. Time, character spacing. And then we have the same values, of course, we can connect for AM, PM. There and there. And then we can type in here AM, PM, character font size, and AM, PM, character spacing. There we go. It's too bad we can't really set the font in geometry nodes, but it is totally fine. Right, so let's just move our time font size right there and our divider character space there. And then finally, we can actually set the offset as a geometry node input as well. Now, I don't really want to place this in the Z direction, I suppose. So what I'm just going to do is I'm going to separate that vector or combine it, combine X, Y, Z. Then I'm going to copy this and paste it in here as like a default value without the meters. There we go. And then we can connect this. And then we have an X offset here and a Y offset. And then we can name that as well to be AM, PM, X offset. I am character sensitive myself. Here we go. AM, PM, Y offset. There we go. And then we have our beautiful clock, right? We can just rotate this and place it how we want now without that affecting the placement of our beautiful PM, AM. So I was just working on a thumbnail and I thought maybe we can also just reverse this timing so we can make it a countdown as well, as you can see from the image. And well, it's actually quite easy. Right now I still have it set on adding. How do we subtract this? Well, it is actually quite easy. So we have an add node. We add our seconds and the preset time we have here, the hours, the minutes, whatever. So we can just duplicate this, set this to a subtract, and we want to start, of course, the timer, the countdown with the value we set in the geometry node here, and we want to subtract the scene time seconds. And then we want to be able to switch, so Shift A, switch between float values, between if it's false, it will just be a timer, if it's true, it will be a countdown. We can drag this out to a group input, and let's rename this automatically to clock/countdown. There we go. And let's just move this all the way to the top because it is the first thing we would want to enable or disable, I suppose. And then we can connect this here. Now, the only thing is that this is not going to stop at 0, sadly. It is just going to minus everything. Which is, well, not really what we want. Unless you do want that. It depends on how this clock, this countdown timer will be scripted, I suppose. But we can also just set this at a minimum value, right? So that means that we can Shift A, find a math node, and we can set this to maximum. The reason why maximum is because it is going to pick the maximum value between the value of the inputs and the second value we have here, which means that if we set 0 here and our outcome value, right, this value here, this output, if this would be lower than 0, it's going to pick the maximum value of those two, which is 0. But if it's higher, it is going to pick the highest value, the input value here. Let's say we set this to 10 seconds, it's going to pick 10 here as an output. 9, subtracting 1 until it is 0, and then it becomes 0, which is the highest value between the two inputs, and it will stay at 0 indefinitely. Right, so this is basically our countdown. Now we want to add this instead of after the switch, we want this to be only at the subtract here. So it's not really going to do that for the other value. There we go. And now we can just, well, have that beautiful countdown, right? Let's say this is going to tick off in 14 seconds. There we go. At some point it's going to be 0 and it will stay at 0. Switch this off and it will just be a clock counting up, right? So that is really as easy as it's gonna get, right? So thank you so much for watching. If you like this, leave a like, a comment, subscribe. I would enjoy any one of those. And I'll see you in the next one. Cheers.